on this last point, I have some reservations. So it seems to me that parents might be motivated to have distinctly different choices than their children in some cases. Like if the concern is building some type of alliance with another family, right? So then you can imagine that the parent would be not interested in the idiosyncratic attributes of the male, but rather, oh, he's from the Hendersons, so he's great, right?
Right.
But why would it be the case that the psychology would be so much different among parents in detecting things like genetic quality or status or other? Do you know where I'm going with that?
Well, I don't know that the mechanisms would be different in terms of assessing, for example, genetic quality in unilateral senses. So, for example, if I'm looking at fluctuating asymmetry, parents should be able to tell that as well as self. If I'm looking at MHC dissimilarity, maybe not so much. That's about a compatibility issue. Also, I don't know that, in a lot of ways, those genetic qualities may not be where parent and offspring preferences diverge very strongly. They may align more in terms of genetic qualities. Having a genetically high-quality mate is good for parents' inclusive fitness, and it's good for one's own fitness. But because there are trade-offs of those with other kinds of features in terms of investment and alliances and all those other things, I might expect that they will be weighted differently.
Okay, thanks for allowing me to push it.
Brooke?
Just two quick points. So, with the conflict role, it seems like you're sort of touching on a key piece of parent-offspring conflict theory, which is that the parent should be invested in. You didn't talk about siblings at all, but siblings are really important, right? Because the parent is motivated to make decisions that are going to be best for their reproductive success, which is for their entire brood of kids, right? And then whereas each child is going to have more interest in himself than in their siblings, and that brings me to bride wealth, because there's a pretty large literature on marriage payments that I think both hit on that idea in terms of how parents distribute across siblings, what differences there are if you have more brothers or more sisters, things like that. There's some good papers out there on that. And then also, it brings me to the mate attraction piece that you have here, because I think that's basically, to my knowledge, like the major way that you could signal your mate quality to the parents, right, is through some sort of bride wealth or dowry. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's, and in fact, that's where you would expect much of that conflict to come in, is this idea, so getting back to Jeff's point too, that if you're assessing just genetic quality, there shouldn't be huge amounts of conflict. If there's somebody's genetically fit, they're genetically fit. But, for example, if you can get a spouse for your daughter who will bring lots of sisters for your sons to marry, that may be much more valuable than somebody who's more genetically fit but has no other reproductive resources for your other children. So yes, absolutely, the bride wealth literature is a place to look. Dan?
I think this is a very illustrative case. One always wants to be careful about how much one generalizes from the specifics of one case. So, I mean, it strikes me that one important feature of this is, at least historically, is a fairly high male homicide rate, which presumably increases the importance of male-male alliances, and probably also increases the pressure for pubertal or pre-pubertal female betrothal, because in a violent world, women can be abducted, right? You need to build those alliances while you can. She's a valuable asset from a father's perspective, and so on. One might expect that in places with maybe lower rates of homicide and, as a consequence, lower rates of polygyny, you can still get plenty of parent-offspring conflict even with later marriage. And in particular, so Eckhart Voland has talked about this some, and I think he's on pretty good grounds in arguing that there are patterns where daughters are often selected as helpers at the nest, where parents interfere with their reproduction in order to keep them home because they're assets for raising younger children. and that's particularly going to be true when you have high fertility rates and intensive labor applications, right?
Yeah.
So then this household labor becomes greater. And there you have a very clear case where, I mean, the guy might be symmetrical and MHC compatible and a whole bunch of other things,
Absolutely.
and they still don't want her to go off with him because they'd rather have her taking care of her
Exactly.
younger siblings, right?
Mhm.
So that can result in pretty dramatic differences of opinion. You might see that less in situations where, you always want to marry your daughters off when they're pubescent because you want to build those alliances and you don't want the possibility of her being abducted or something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that this, the point of this illustration or these examples is simply that even in a case where there is restriction of one sort or another, women have strategies available to them and they do actually act on those. And that absolutely I would expect that the locus of conflict would vary based on the context, and therefore the strategies actually would also vary somewhat. But that's where I get to that bottom point of that. I would expect that the mechanisms should be sensitive to what are the costs and benefits of either fighting over these conflicts or going along with your parents' wishes.
Yeah, and just one more footnote, and I can't remember whether we talked about this or not. This may not be present in this particular ethnographic case, but along with suicide, I think a very common pattern around the world is some kind of spirit possession, where people, you have culture-bound syndromes of illness, where people are not consciously feigning their possession, and yet young, recently married women are disproportionately likely to be spirit possessed, and the treatment usually involves her moving back to her village, rearranging her
Right.
life, right?
Yep.
The same kind of, basically willingness to suffer costs that you get with suicide.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I would consider that to be along the same lines as the attempted suicide case in this. Yeah. Clark.
I was thinking about the problem of, or the issue of asymmetries of information. So the parents and kids know different things.
Yes, absolutely.
And you might think, one thing that we've seen in Shuar cases, which I think is true also probably in our culture, is that sometimes the younger people will pick somebody who the parents regard as a loser, right? And that'll be the objections the parents have. This guy is just not.
Right.
And you might think, in some ways that you might think the parents probably have better estimates of who's likely to be successful, right? They know, there's some reason to think they know this guy, who
They know
his
the
family
family
is. They also have experience seeing people growing up and knowing what kind of person at 14 is going to be a successful person at 20 or 25 or whatever. On the other hand, then the kids have more experience, right, with the other individuals. So I was thinking when you mentioned, it's not just, there's even genetic things that are not just the appearance of the person, but certain aspects of intelligence that the parents might not see because they actually don't know this suitor.
Right.
It would be interesting. I was just thinking it would be interesting, an interesting study to actually ask kids and parents or different people in different age groups to predict the future success of individuals and see, and then look at that. For example, ask them also to rate these people as potential mates or whatever, and to see, what the nature of that asymmetry. What the nature of that asymmetry is.
Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Because sometimes it's like, oh, that guy's a loser, or but things change over the course of a generation. So, one family that used to be very prominent could now, it could switch.
Well, and the other piece of information that parents may not have is sort of local status level too. So if females use as a cue a guy's status with other guys, and parents aren't necessarily privy to those social machinations, but a girl may be. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of ways where it's it's an empirical question as to who's better at predicting this, and it may vary by context and by how stable the environment is. Would be what I would expect would be the biggest predictor of who's better at it. So yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah, Michelle.
So I wonder if you've thought about the conflict between the father and the mother, and whether they have different.
Between the father and the mother?
Yeah, and whether they have different preferences for their daughters, and whether mothers have strategies to influence the father's ultimate decision.
Yeah, I have thought about that a little. I haven't thought about it in any very systematic way. But yes, I do expect that there would likely be conflicts of interest between mothers and fathers over the mating decisions of their offspring as well. And I would be very interested in looking at what kinds of strategies mothers have for influencing that. I think it's an interesting question. There's been a lot of discussion that fathers have much more influence and much more interest in influencing daughters' reproductive choices, and yet culturally it seems that very often it's mothers who are given the job of enforcing that. So that's sort of an area that you might look for where those conflicts might be and how they might be negotiated.
It seems like there's a conflict in the age at which each parent would want daughters to marry off. If the mother wants helpers and the father wants to basically use the resource right away.
Right. Well, and there's also the fact that, mothers, at least experientially, subjectively, what they will say is that they don't want their daughters to get married very young because it sucked for them. They're like, I don't want my daughter to do this because it was hard, and I'd rather her get an education and everything. So, fathers may not feel that quite as much, but that's, in terms of digging deeper into it, I'm not real sure. Perfect.
One of the things that came up is this conflict between parents and children in terms of averaging across the kids and versus what the kid wants. And I don't know if people have looked at this, but could you look at the conflict versus the coincidence between the parents and the child as a function of the number of siblings and the composition of those siblings?
That'd be a really good way to do it, yes, absolutely. To look at, would we expect, for example, we would expect parents and offspring's interests to align more perhaps if they're only children, or if they have very few other siblings, or if they're siblings of the same sex versus siblings of the opposite sex. So absolutely, that'd be a way to get some traction on this. Yes?
Do you think mate choice and parental choice would produce men and women who act and behave differently, act and look differently, I should say?
So would they have differential effects on the
phenotype?
Yeah, phenotypes of men. I think they could, and I think that you probably see some outcomes of both of those kinds of mate attraction pressures in men. So, for example, this idea that parents and daughters may have very different information about what a man's doing. So a man may be signaling in some ways to parents, to kin, in terms of their ability to produce things, or ability to be a good hunter, or ability to be reliable, maybe signaling something very different to potential mates in terms of their status amongst other guys, their risk-taking, all those kinds of things. So, I think it's an empirical question, but I think, absolutely, I would expect that both things are affecting the phenotype of males.
Well, would you be able to make it so empirical that you could predict in advance what
Which
men
ones?
should look like if there's parental choice, and what men should look like?
I think
if
you could
there
make
is
some predictions.
female choice?
I think you could make some predictions about what kinds of things you would expect to see. For example, again, I off the cuff would predict that under contexts where there's strong parental choice, you might expect more signaling of things like resources and social connectedness might be some of the things that I would predict off the cuff. Whereas for direct mate choice, you might predict more signaling of things like genetic quality and generosity or kindness. I don't know, those are totally off the cuff ideas. Marty looks dubious.
No, I just think it's a great question.
It is a great question. I mean, really, that's where I would like to go with this, is to sit down and think about precisely those kinds of questions. What would we predict? That's what I mean by, I think we should be able to find evidence for special design, but we have to sit down and think about exactly how we would expect the different selective pressures to affect phenotype.
Well, to be fair, Apostolou does suggest that. He suggests that
Yes.
that you should have design
Yes,
for
this is not intended as a
impressing,
judgment. He does.
impressing the girl's father.
Yes, he absolutely does say that.
Well, and to be fair, the parents and children, ultimately, whatever measure of status is best correlated with reproductive success, both parents and children should be looking for that same measure. So I'm not not quite as convinced that it should be as disparate.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think it's, you know, it can vary quite a lot how disparate it is, and I think that that's where these questions of how much influence it has on the reproductive success of of siblings, how many other siblings, all of those kinds of questions I think would impact strongly
Yeah,
how.
but if
much
children
it
and
works.
parents are choosing different, have very different ideas about what's best, then one of them is wrong. And
It's not right, no, because the parents may be maximizing their reproductive interests at the expense of their daughters, right? So
yeah, no, I understand that, but I mean, in terms of like phenotypic quality, that's a different layer than I guess what I'm referring to, which is that like, still, whatever measure of status, is the best measure of status that's correlated with reproductive success. Both parents might wager that differently across siblings, but that should still be the best measure.
So you're saying that you wouldn't see differential effects in the phenotype?
I'm just not sure it's gonna.
Well, I think the idea was that the difference wouldn't be in how phenotypes express specific things it's supposed to be signaling, but how much weight is given to any given signal by different parties. So people would have the same signal of status for either one, which whether the parent or the potential mate actually care enough about that to choose this person over a different person is where the pressures are going to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the idea is which component is being emphasized. So for example, when I was saying that if signaling to a potential mate, it may be more about how much you would invest in that particular mate, whereas if it's signaling to potential parents or parents-in-law, it may be signaling more about what you bring to the entire reproductive success of the family. Now, the qualities shouldn't differ. The qualities are, if you're good at getting stuff and you have social connections and you are, a good hunter or you have good genes and all that, those qualities aren't different. But in terms of which ones are weighted by the chooser, it depends on how they're, what effects they're trying to get from them, whether they're trying to affect overall inclusiveness for the parents or for the individual. Rob?
So I agree with your point you made earlier about selection doesn't just aim for the average, it takes into account the ability wants to adapt as many possible environments as possible. But I think you went a little overboard on the argument, and I don't like the example very much.
Okay.
So, I mean, we define altitude, high altitude is 2,500 meters, but the same physiological processes will work at 1,000 meters, right? And that's much, much more common, particularly in Africa, which is a very high continent. And so, and I think, in general, there's going to be a trade-off between evolving special purpose mechanisms and the frequency with which those things get expressed. Because if they're only expressed, it looked like the area under the curve is like something like 1 in 100. That means that if it really were true that it was only in those environments that those genes were subject to selection, that means selection 100 times weaker than it would be in some gene that was expressed in every environment. So, and I would think that things like altitude and there's evidence that we adapt to temperature, humidity, and some other things with these generalized physiological processes. These are really old. They're not species specific. They're family specific or something. I think you need to make and I agree with the general point that it's a mistake to say that a third of the time you're measuring 2/3 of the time female preferences matter. That's fine, but if it's 1% of the time, then I'm a skeptic.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's why I think both of those, and I may have gone overboard, which I tend to do sometimes.
A little stronger than I think is really.
But because I do think that it, both those points hold. That one, it does not need to be the case that everybody all the time exerts choice. But the other point I think is very strong, which is that I think that there's a huge underestimation of the amount of female choice that's out there if you take things like the society has been categorized as parental choice.
Well, I mean, it seems to me you ought to make the argument the other way around, because it's really true that if only 1% of the time female choice mattered, then the whole exercise is
Yeah.
not worth doing, because what you're trying to show is that
The opposite.
it happens often enough that,
Mhm.
that it matters.
Mhm.
We don't know really what that is, but
Right.
60% is way different from 1%.
Yes, yes, I agree. Thank you. Marty?
Great talk. And I'm not just saying that because I'm your collaborator and friend. I thought that was really fantastic. And I like the fact that it was focused so that we could have this, more open discussion, because there's a lot of new potential research questions here. So I'm thinking about the last point here, and I'm wondering, well, that sort of led me to a prior question, which has to do with change over time. So you've said that even within the Shuar, it looks like women are exercising more choice, or at least that's become more explicitly okay. And I'm wondering why you think that's the case. And the reason that question, I think, is interesting is whether female choice might have changed over our species' evolutionary history. And it connects with this point. Sorry, this is a multi-pronged question, but it connects with this last point, because I'm wondering if, times are really tough, resources are scarce, then does that give females a lot less bargaining power, because they couldn't just abandon their families. They couldn't run off to cities. Do Shuar women have more bargaining power because resources have, this is just one
That's
possible
yeah,
story.
I mean, that's,
Resources have become more abundant, or because there are cities they can run away to, and that leads to this general question about, what were things like over our species' evolutionary history? Do we think that the amount of female choice that you're seeing, or even a fraction of the amount of female choice that you're seeing here, was characteristic of our species' evolutionary history?
yeah, well, that's a very, very good question, an important question in terms of whether or not we think this is true, that female choice has mattered. I think that yes, resources clearly have an impact on how much choice women can and do exert. That said, as it still seems to me from the ethnographic literature, including some of the stuff that I've seen with the Shuar, that even in difficult resource times, women still will take huge chances and incur potentially huge costs to pursue their choices. Now, I think where the work needs to be done is to really specify that. What are the benefits that are really worth risking these huge costs for? What are the costs of the parental choice that are worth risking it all to do better? I think another thing that might be interesting is to think about the rate of change in the environment. So, for example, if the environment is not changing, the social environment or the ecology is not changing very quickly, it may actually be a better strategy to take your parents' choices. They may, as you said, they may know better. They have more information about what works in this environment, what the developmental trajectory looks like of potential mates. Whereas in a rapidly changing environment, you might actually expect that female choice will become more important because parents don't have the same kind of information. Again, just some off-the-cuff ideas.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's an interesting question how much these choices are sort of tracking. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is going to be culturally evolved norms about what ideal mates are that can track the way but and I don't know how common this is across ancestral environments, but in this particular place, up until quite recently, there was the reproductive version of a military coup all the time, right? Where, you've got people would go found these villages, and we know that there's individual guys who have hundreds of grandchildren, right? Because they took off, and founded some village in the middle of nowhere, and then ended up. And so you have takeovers where one guy will kill everybody else in the village, and then he'll be like the guy who's now the grandfather of everybody. So I think when you have a stable thing, right, where the land is carved out and people have, and those kinds of things aren't possible, then you might have, mate preferences for people who, mate men who are kind of like doing well in the way that the current social hierarchy is, and they have status and they have families. But it's also possible that, some women could be choosing traits that correlate with, this guy is like a big risk taker who's going to, right now he looks like a loser, but there could be a risky kind of thing where I'm gambling on a guy who could end up being like a huge guy because genetically he's great, but he has the bad luck of the draw in terms of like the current social situation. But if he went off and founded a new village, he could be.
And then you might expect that to interact with the, female's mate value and things like that.
Yeah.
Who's gonna go for the risky gamble? Who's gonna go for the one that's, got the more reliable return, but at a lower rate? Stephen?
Well, with Marty's point about logical variation in female choice, the ethnographer of the beginning in New Britain, in Papua New Guinea, she claimed that historically it was a case of 100% almost female choice, where to the extent where females would abduct males.
Huh. I have not read this.
Yeah, so you might want to look into
Yeah, I
that.
will.
Maybe.
I will.
And I don't know why it's the case, but
Yeah,
there's
I'm not
variation
familiar with
in
that,
the
so
idea.
I will definitely look into it. Thank you. I'll have to get you to give me the citation again.
So I'm sympathetic to Rob's concerns about the line of argument, especially given special things about, say, populations in the Andes or in Himalayas who are subject uniformly to the same selection pressure, and that's not what you're wanting to talk about here. I think, however, it's reasonable to suggest that that the very existence of these elaborate institutions to control female reproductive behavior suggests that they're not easy to control, right? And that they haven't ever been, right? So, I mean, the fact that you have these elaborate claustration and surgical practices and all the other things, you keep upping the costs as the basically as the political value of women increases, right? In order to try and preserve the market value of any one individual.
Right.
And you have to do that because people have different incentives, right? That is, the daughter's incentives are not the same as the father's.
Right.
So, I mean, it's always struck me as a little odd that Apostolou pays as much attention to those institutions as he does without reading that as evidence of a conflict of
Exactly.
interest
Yeah.
at the level of motivation,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, sort of along the same lines that, I know you're perfectly well aware of this, but it seems like it got a little bit lost in the shuffle of the discussion that female choice is the default from which, let's assume, is the default from which humans subsequently changed, and then preferences for symmetry probably predate language, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of aspects of female-made preferences that the difficult question isn't whether or not you would have choice, but as Dan was saying, what cultures have done to block that choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think the other critical thing is, and this is sort of my point here at the end, is that to me the question of whether or not females have choices is almost, uncontroversial, although apparently it is controversial. But really what is important, and absolutely Apostolou does make this point, this is what I think is very valuable, is the fact that what's unique in human evolutionary history is that other people are involved in those choices as well. We don't see that in other animals, that third parties have any say in mating decisions. So I think that's the money in this is to look at those adaptations that are specifically designed for third party mate attraction and mate selection. Perfect.
One more,
Oh,
time for
sorry.
one more question.
Or Sarah.
So I was wondering to what extent the conflict is only like kin versus and the female who's getting married versus the community at large and the individual.
Yeah, I didn't talk at all about the communities, but I do expect that could potentially occur too. I haven't really thought yet much beyond kin, but certainly I would think that there could be conflicts on a larger community level as well. But I haven't really thought much about that. Sorry.
Okay, that's the end of our question
It's a
time.
really
so-
unsatisfying final answer.
Yeah. But it was a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.